"Get your kid off my fence before the wolves do it for you." That's exactly what I yelled at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Standing barefoot in my own front yard, coffee splashing out of my mug as I pointed furiously at a child dangling off the top of my chain-link fence. Behind him, 50 strangers were sprawled across my land, laughing, eating sandwiches, and acting like they'd just discovered Disneyland. And leading this circus of chaos was Karen, the self-crowned queen of the HOA, waving her clipboard around like it was the Constitution. Let me tell you something. When you buy 20 acres of private land in Idaho, you do it for one reason: peace and quiet. You don't expect to wake up to a full-blown suburban invasion complete with folding chairs, volleyball nets, and toddlers climbing fences like they're auditioning for American Ninja Warrior. But there they were, treating my property like it was their personal playground. And Karen? Oh, Karen was standing smack in the middle of it all, shouting instructions like she was hosting a 4th of July parade. I stormed down from my porch, still clutching my coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping me sane. "Excuse me," I shouted over the racket. "What in the hell is going on here?" Karen turned around slowly, giving me one of those fake smiles that could curdle milk. "Oh, Jack, good morning. Isn't it just a perfect day for a community picnic?" "Community picnic?" I repeated, blinking in disbelief. "On my land?" "Yes," she said breezily, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "We thought this space would be perfect for everyone to enjoy. You don't mind, do you?" "Mind? Did I mind? Let me ask you something. How would you feel if you woke up to find 50 strangers trampling across your property like it's their personal park? Would you stay calm? Would you lose your mind? Or would you do what I did? Stand there in stunned silence while your brain tried to process the sheer audacity of it all? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I'm still trying to figure out if I handled this right. Anyway, after a few seconds of internal screaming, I managed to compose myself enough to respond. "Karen," I said through gritted teeth, "this is private property. You can't just show up with 50 people and throw a party here." She waved her hand dismissively like I just told her aliens were invading. "Oh, Jack," she said with a laugh that made my blood boil, "don't be so uptight. This land is part of the HOA's jurisdiction now. It's for everyone to enjoy." Now let me tell you something about Karen and her precious HOA. They're like that one kid in school who always insisted on being team captain but couldn't throw a ball to save their life. They love rules when they're the ones making them, and they love power trips even more. But here's the thing. My property isn't part of their jurisdiction. It never has been. When I bought this land years ago, I made sure it was outside their reach because I didn't want anyone telling me how to live my life. So you can imagine my frustration when Karen tried to pull this nonsense on me. On my own land. "Karen," I said as calmly as possible given the circumstances, "this is not HOA property. This is private property that I own outright. You need to pack up your picnic and leave." She raised an eyebrow at me like I just told her gravity wasn't real and said, "Oh, Jack, don't be ridiculous. This land is clearly part of our community space." "Clearly," I repeated, trying not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Karen, there are no trespassing signs everywhere." She shrugged like those signs were mere suggestions and said, "Well, maybe you should take them down if you don't want people getting confused." Confused? The only thing confusing here was how someone could have this much audacity without spontaneously combusting from sheer arrogance. At this point, my patience was wearing thinner than cheap toilet paper, but I decided to give her one last chance to do the right thing. "Karen," I said firmly, "if you don't leave right now, I'm going to call the police." And do you know what she did? She laughed. An actual belly laugh, and said, "Oh, please, Jack. The police aren't going to waste their time on something like this." Now let me pause here for a second because this is where things start to get really interesting. You see, Karen didn't know something very important about my property. Something that made her little picnic not just rude but downright reckless. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's just say that after her little eye-roll routine and dismissive attitude, Karen turned back to her guests and started clapping her hands like some kind of deranged cheerleader. "All right, everyone," she shouted over the music. "Let's get ready for sack races." And that's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just ignoring me. She was actively mocking me on my own land. It's one thing to trespass. It's another thing entirely to treat someone like they're an inconvenience on their own property. So there I stood, coffee mug in one hand, phone in the other, trying to decide whether to call the cops or handle the situation myself. And then it dawned on me, why call for backup when I already had all the help I needed right here at home? Because you see, Karen didn't realize that she wasn't just trespassing on private property. She was trespassing on wolf territory. So there I was, standing on my own property, watching Karen and her merry band of trespassers treat my land like it was their personal picnic paradise. And as much as I wanted to march back to the house, grab my phone and call the cops, I decided that this situation required a more educational approach. You see, Karen had made one fatal mistake. She assumed that just because she was loud and bossy, the rules didn't apply to her. But oh, they did. And lucky for me, I had the perfect way to remind her. Now, before we dive into the juicy part of this story, let me explain something about Idaho law. Owning wolves isn't just legal here. It's regulated down to the last detail. When I decided to adopt a breeding pair of wolves as part of a conservation program, I had to jump through more hoops than a circus elephant. Permits, inspections, reporting requirements, you name it, I did it. My wolves are tattooed for identification, registered with the Department of Fish and Game, and live in a secure enclosure that meets every legal standard imaginable. In short, these wolves are as legit as it gets. But Karen didn't know any of this. She thought she could waltz onto my property without consequences. And that's when I realized it was time to introduce her to the real residents of this land. I walked back up to the house with purpose, coffee mug still in hand, and headed straight for the enclosure where my wolves live. Now, let me clarify something. These wolves aren't aggressive or dangerous unless provoked. They're well-fed, well-cared for, and generally uninterested in humans. But they're still wolves, majestic, powerful creatures that command respect simply by existing. And if Karen wanted to play queen of the HOA on my property, she was about to get an unforgettable lesson in humility. I opened the gate to their enclosure and stepped inside. As soon as they saw me, my two wolves, Luna and Thor, trotted over with tails wagging like oversized dogs. I gave them each a pat on the head and said, "All right, guys, we've got some guests who need a little education. Now don't worry. I wasn't about to unleash them on Karen's picnic party like some kind of medieval siege weapon. No, that would have been illegal and frankly too dramatic even for me. Instead, I grabbed their leashes and walked them out toward the chaos unfolding on my lawn. The moment Karen spotted me walking toward her with two full-grown wolves at my side, her expression changed faster than a toddler dropping their ice cream cone. Her smug smile vanished, replaced by wide-eyed panic as she stammered, What are those?" "These," I said casually. "Oh, these are just my wolves, Luna and Thor. They live here." Karen's face went pale as she looked from me to the wolves and back again. "Wolves?" she shrieked. "You can't have wolves. That's illegal." "Actually," I said with a grin that probably made her blood boil, "it's perfectly legal in Idaho, as long as you follow all the regulations. And trust me when I say that I've followed them." At this point, some of her picnic guests started noticing what was happening and slowly began packing up their things. Apparently, picnic on private property wasn't nearly as appealing when there were wolves involved. Karen tried to regain control of the situation by waving her clipboard around like it was some kind of magical talisman. "This land is part of the HOA," she shouted desperately. "You can't have wild animals here. It's against community guidelines." "Karen," I said calmly but firmly, "this land is not part of your HOA jurisdiction. It's private property that I own outright, and these wolves are here legally under Idaho state law." To drive the point home, I pulled out a folder containing copies of all my permits and handed it to her. She flipped through it with trembling hands before finally snapping it shut and glaring at me like I just ruined her entire day. Which, let's be honest, I probably did. "You can't just scare people off with wolves," she hissed. "Karen," I said with mock sympathy, "I'm not scaring anyone off. You're trespassing on private property that happens to have wolves living on it. If you don't want to deal with them, maybe you shouldn't be here." At this point, most of her guests had gotten the memo and were making hasty exits toward their cars. A few brave souls tried to pretend they weren't terrified by casually strolling away. But trust me when I say that nobody wanted to stick around long enough for Luna or Thor to get curious. Karen stood there fuming as her picnic party disbanded around her like a poorly planned flash mob. She opened her mouth to argue again but quickly closed it when Thor let out a low growl. Not aggressive or threatening, just enough to remind everyone who really owned this land. Finally, she threw up her hands in defeat and stormed off toward her car without another word. As the last vehicle disappeared down the dirt road leading away from my property, I turned back toward Luna and Thor with a satisfied smile on my face. "Good job," I said as they wagged their tails happily. And just like that, peace was restored. Now look, I know some people might think what I did was overkill or unnecessary drama, but let me ask you this. If someone invaded your home without permission and refused to leave even after you asked nicely, wouldn't you do whatever it took to protect what's yours? Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about Karen or her ridiculous picnic. It was about standing up for myself and reminding people that private property is exactly that. Private. So if you ever find yourself dealing with an HOA dictator who thinks they can walk all over you, remember this story. You don't need fancy lawyers or endless arguments. Sometimes all it takes is two majestic wolves and a healthy dose of audacity. And trust me, Karen won't be coming back anytime soon. So you'd think that after being chased off my property, figuratively of course, by two fully legal, fully majestic wolves, Karen would have learned her lesson. You'd think she'd go home, pour herself a glass of boxed wine, and reflect on the choices that led her to this moment. Maybe even Google trespassing laws or how not to embarrass yourself in public. But no, this is Karen we're talking about. And if there's one thing I've learned about Karens, it's that they don't retreat, they regroup. The very next morning, I was greeted by the sound of tires crunching down my dirt road. I peeked out the window and, sure enough, there she was, Karen, marching toward my front door like she was leading an army into battle. Except this time, she wasn't alone. Oh no, she'd brought reinforcements. 2 other HOA board members and what appeared to be a lawyer in a cheap suit carrying a briefcase that screamed, "I got this at Walmart." Now, let me just say, I'm not a confrontational guy by nature. I moved out to this land to avoid exactly this kind of nonsense. But when someone shows up on your property uninvited again, after you've already told them to leave, well, at some point you've got to stand your ground. So I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, because apparently that's my signature move now, and said, "Karen, back so soon? What can I do for you today?" She didn't even crack a smile. Instead, she pointed at me like she was accusing me of witchcraft and said, "Jack, we're here to inform you that your wolves are a violation of HOA regulations and must be removed immediately." I blinked at her for a moment, trying to process the sheer stupidity of what she just said. "Karen," I replied slowly, "for the last time, I am not part of your HOA. My property is not under your jurisdiction." "That's where you're wrong," she snapped, gesturing to the lawyer beside her like he was some kind of legal wizard who could make her delusions reality. "Mr. Thompson here has reviewed the HOA bylaws and confirmed that your property falls within our boundaries." I raised an eyebrow at Mr. Thompson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but there. "Is that so?" I asked him. He cleared his throat awkwardly and said, "Well, there's some ambiguity in the property lines as outlined in the original HOA charter." "Ambiguity?" I interrupted. "Let me save you some time. There's no ambiguity. My property was explicitly excluded from the HOA when it was established because the previous owner didn't want anything to do with it, and neither do I." Karen crossed her arms and smirked like she just caught me in a lie. "Do you have proof of that?" she asked smugly. "Oh, Karen. Sweet, naive Karen, of course I had proof. This wasn't my first rodeo with overreaching HOAs trying to flex their imaginary muscles on land they don't own. So I went back inside, grabbed my file folder, the same one I'd shown her yesterday, and pulled out a copy of the original deed along with a letter from the county zoning office confirming that my property was not part of the HOA. When I handed it to Mr. Thompson, His face turned about 3 shades paler as he read through it. Well, this does seem pretty clear," he mumbled before turning to Karen and adding quietly, "I think he's right." Karen snatched the papers out of his hands and skimmed through them herself before glaring at me, like I just ruined her entire week. Again. "Fine," she hissed through gritted teeth. "But those wolves are still dangerous and shouldn't be allowed anywhere near our community." "Dangerous," I repeated with a laugh. "Karen, my wolves are better behaved than half the people in this neighborhood, including you." That probably wasn't the most diplomatic thing to say. But hey, sometimes the truth hurts. At this point, one of Karen's backup board members decided to chime in with what they clearly thought was a brilliant idea. "Maybe we should call animal control," they suggested smugly. I couldn't help but laugh again, this time louder than before. "Go ahead," I said with a grin. "Call them." In fact, I pulled out my phone and started dialing right then and there. Why don't we call them together? They know me pretty well since they're the ones who inspected my enclosure and approved all my permits. Karen looked like she was about to explode as I held up my phone and said cheerfully into the receiver, "Hi, this is Jack over on address. Just wanted to let you know that some folks from the HOA are here questioning my wolf's legality again. You mind sending someone out to clear things up?" The person on the other end must have recognized my voice because they laughed and said they'd send someone over right away. While we waited for animal control to arrive, Karen stood there fuming while her lawyer tried desperately to pretend he wasn't part of this train wreck. When the officer finally showed up about 20 minutes later, a friendly guy named Mike who'd been out to inspect my property before, he took one look at Karen's group and sighed like he already knew exactly what kind of nonsense he was walking into. "Morning, Jack," he said with a nod before turning to Karen and asking politely but firmly, "What seems to be the problem here?" Karen launched into another tirade about how my wolves were dangerous and shouldn't be allowed near her community, which Mike listened to patiently before turning back to me with an amused expression. "Jack," he said dryly, "are these still the same wolves we inspected last year?" "Yep," I replied with a grin. "And they're still in full compliance with state regulations?" "Absolutely." Mike turned back to Karen with a shrug and said simply, "Then there's no issue here." You could practically see the steam coming out of Karen's ears as she sputtered incoherently for a few seconds before finally storming off without another word. Her lawyer and board member lackeys trailing behind her like defeated soldiers retreating from battle. As their cars disappeared down the road once again, Mike turned back to me with a chuckle and said, "You've got more patience than I do dealing with people like that." "Patience?" I replied with a laugh of my own. "I'm just getting started." And with that, peace was restored for now. Now, you'd think that after being humiliated not once, but twice, Karen would finally accept defeat. You'd think she'd pack up her clipboard, delete my address from her GPS, and move on to terrorizing someone else about the length of their grass or the color of their mailbox. But no, Karen wasn't just persistent. She was relentless, like a bad cold that just won't go away. She kept coming back, determined to make my life as miserable as possible. It started small, passive-aggressive notes left in my mailbox. The first one read, "Your wolves are a danger to the community. Please consider relocating them for everyone's safety." It was written in perfect cursive on HOA letterhead, of course. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash without a second thought. The next day, another note appeared. "Your property is an eyesore. Please clean up your yard to maintain neighborhood standards." Now, let me tell you something about my yard. It's not an eyesore. Sure, it's not manicured like a golf course, but it's clean, well-maintained, and exactly how I like it. Besides, if anyone's property was an eyesore, it was Karen's. Her yard looked like Hobby Lobby threw up on it with all those tacky lawn ornaments and seasonal decorations. By the third note, which accused me of violating noise ordinances because of my wolves howling at all hours, which they don't, I realized Karen wasn't going to stop until I did something about it. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. First, I installed security cameras around my property. Not just any cameras, high-definition ones with night vision and motion detection. If Karen or any of her minions so much as set foot on my land again, I'd have video evidence to back me up. And let me tell you, There's nothing more satisfying than catching someone in the act when they think they're being sneaky. Next, I decided to hit Karen where it hurt, her precious HOA bylaws. You see, while Karen was busy trying to enforce rules that didn't apply to me, she'd conveniently ignored the fact that her own property was in violation of several HOA regulations. For example, her fence was 2 feet taller than the maximum height allowed by the HOA charter. Her front yard had more than the permitted number of decorative items. Yes, that's an actual rule. And let's not forget about the unapproved shed she'd built in her backyard without submitting the proper paperwork. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. Now, you might be wondering why I'd bother filing a complaint with an organization I wasn't even part of. The answer is simple: Karen lived for the HOA. It was her entire identity. If there was one thing that could knock her off her high horse, it was being called out for breaking the very rules she claimed to uphold. A week later, I got a call from one of the other HOA board members, a guy named Steve who seemed genuinely embarrassed by Karen's behavior. He apologized profusely for everything she'd put me through and promised to look into my complaints about her property violations. I could tell he wasn't thrilled about having to confront Karen. Who would be? But he assured me he'd handle it, and handle it he did. 2 days later, I saw Steve and another board member standing in Karen's front yard with clipboards in hand, while she argued with them in what appeared to be a full-blown meltdown. From what I could hear, and yes, I absolutely eavesdropped, they were giving her a list of things she needed to fix in order to comply with HOA regulations, including tearing down her oversized fence and removing half of her lawn ornaments. Watching Karen get a taste of her own medicine was like watching karma unfold in real time. It was beautiful, but Karen being Karen couldn't just let it go. No, she had to escalate things even further. A few days later, I came home to find a county inspector waiting for me in my driveway. Apparently, someone had filed an anonymous complaint claiming that my wolf enclosure wasn't up to code and posed a safety risk to the community. Gee, I wonder who could have done that? Fortunately for me, and unfortunately for Karen, the inspector found absolutely nothing wrong with my setup. In fact, he complimented me on how well-maintained everything was and even asked if he could take some photos for training purposes. By the time he left, I was feeling pretty smug, but also a little annoyed that Karen had wasted both my time and his. So I decided it was time to send Karen a message she couldn't ignore. The next morning, I went out and bought 2 giant metal signs that read, "Private Property. Trespassers will be prosecuted," in bold red letters. Then I installed them on either side of my driveway where they were impossible to miss. But I didn't stop there. I also printed out copies of all my permits and legal documents related to my wolves and laminated them so they were weatherproof. Then I attached them to a wooden board and mounted it near the entrance to my property with another sign that said, "4 questions about my wolves or property rights. Read this before bothering me." Was it overkill? Maybe. But if there's one thing I've learned from dealing with people like Karen, it's that sometimes you have to be louder than they are if you want them to back off. And guess what? It worked. For the first time in weeks, there were no notes in my mailbox. No surprise visits from lawyers or inspectors. No passive-aggressive comments shouted from across the street while I mowed my lawn. It was blissfully quiet, and not just because of my wolves. Of course, knowing Karen, this probably wasn't the end of our little feud, but for now, peace had been restored once again. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted in the first place. For a brief, glorious moment, I thought it was over. The signs were up, the laminated legal documents were proudly displayed, and Karen had retreated to her lair of passive-aggressive Pinterest projects. The air around my property felt lighter, quieter, peaceful even. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally accepted defeat. But of course, I underestimated her. Because Karen wasn't just your average HOA tyrant. She was the Michael Jordan of pettiness. And when she couldn't win the game, she decided to change the rules entirely. It all started with a letter. Not one of her usual handwritten notes stuffed in my mailbox. No, this one came certified mail, complete with an official-looking HOA letterhead and a return address for their lawyer's office. I opened it cautiously, half expecting it to burst into flames or release a swarm of angry bees. Instead, It contained a single sheet of paper with the following message. Dear Mr. Jack, the HOA has recently voted to expand its jurisdiction to include your property. As a result, you are now subject to all HOA rules and regulations effective immediately. Please find attached a copy of our bylaws for your reference. Attached was a 50-page document filled with rules about everything from acceptable paint colors to how many garden gnomes were allowed on your lawn. Spoiler alert, it's 2. I flipped through it in disbelief, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate prank. But no, it was real. Karen and her cronies had actually rewritten the HOA boundaries to include my property without so much as a courtesy call. Now, I'm no legal expert, but even I knew this was shady as hell. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called my lawyer. My lawyer, let's call him Dave, was a no-nonsense kind of guy who specialized in property disputes. When I explained the situation to him, he let out a long sigh and said, Jack, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. But unfortunately, it's not unheard of. Apparently, HOAs pulling stunts like this wasn't uncommon in certain parts of the country. They'd redraw their boundaries on a whim, hoping homeowners wouldn't bother fighting back because they didn't want to deal with the hassle or expense of legal action. But lucky for me, and unlucky for Karen, I wasn't about to roll over and let her get away with it. Dave assured me that we had a strong case since my original deed explicitly excluded my property from the HOA's jurisdiction. He also pointed out several procedural errors in how they'd gone about expanding their boundaries, errors that made their entire vote null and void. In other words, Karen had overplayed her hand. So while Dave got to work drafting a formal response on my behalf, I decided to have a little fun in the meantime. First things first, I printed out another copy of my laminated legal documents, the ones proving that my wolves were 100% legal and above board, and added a new section titled, Why My Property is Not Part of Your HOA and Never Will Be. Then I mounted it right next to my mailbox where anyone walking by could read it. Next, I went online and ordered 2 massive flags, one that said Private Property in bold red letters and another featuring a giant wolf howling at the moon. When they arrived a few days later, I hoisted them up on flagpoles at the entrance to my driveway like some kind of defiant medieval lord declaring independence from the kingdom. But my piece de resistance? That came when I decided to host my own little community event. You see, Karen loved throwing HOA-sponsored events, barbecues, yard sales, holiday parties, you name it. And since she'd been so kind as to include me in her precious HOA without asking for my permission, I figured it was only fair that I return the favor by inviting her and the rest of the neighborhood to an event on my terms. I called it Wolf Awareness Day. I sent out invitations, printed on wolf-themed stationery, to every house in the neighborhood, including Karen's, inviting them to come learn about wolf conservation efforts while enjoying free snacks and refreshments courtesy of yours truly. The invitation also included a disclaimer that read, This event is hosted on private property, not affiliated with the HOA. On the day of the event, I set up tables with brochures about wolf conservation programs and had Luna and Thor lounging nearby in their enclosure looking majestic as ever. A local wildlife expert even volunteered to give a short presentation about why wolves are important for maintaining healthy ecosystems. To my surprise and Karen's horror, a decent number of people actually showed up. Some were genuinely interested in learning more about wolves. Others just wanted free snacks and an excuse to snoop around my property. Either way, it was a success. Karen herself didn't make an appearance. Shocking. But word must have gotten back to her because later that evening I received yet another letter, this time accusing me of hosting an unauthorized event in violation of HOA rules. I couldn't help but laugh as I read it because by then Dave had already sent his response letter to their lawyer outlining all the ways their boundary expansion vote was invalid and threatening legal action if they didn't back off immediately. A week later, I got another certified letter from the HOA's lawyer, this one much less aggressive than before. It basically boiled down to, We've decided not to pursue jurisdiction over your property at this time. Translation, they knew they'd lost. And just like that, Karen's reign of terror came to an end, or at least as far as I was concerned. Now look, I know not everyone has wolves or lawyers or enough petty energy to fight back against an overreaching HOA dictator like Karen. But if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, It's this, don't let people push you around just because they think they can get away with it. Sometimes all it takes is standing your ground and maybe hoisting up a giant wolf flag to remind them who's really in charge. After Karen's HOA officially backed down, I thought I'd finally reached the finish line. The flags were still flying proudly at the entrance to my property. Luna and Thor were happily lounging in their enclosure, and the laminated, "Why my property is not part of your HOA" sign was still standing tall next to my mailbox. Life was good, peaceful, quiet. But of course, Karen wasn't done. Because Karen doesn't quit. No, Karen simply evolves. About a month after the whole boundary expansion debacle, I noticed something strange. My mail started arriving late. Packages that should have been delivered in 2 days were taking a week. Bills were showing up past their due dates. At first, I chalked it up to the usual inefficiencies of the postal system, until one day, I caught Karen standing at my mailbox. Now, let me be clear. This wasn't a casual stroll past my property. She wasn't walking her dog or delivering cookies to a neighbor. No, Karen was standing there with her phone out, taking pictures of my mailbox like she was gathering evidence for some kind of federal case. I stepped outside and called out, "Karen, can I help you with something?" She jumped like she'd been caught robbing a bank, then quickly tried to compose herself. "Oh, Jack, I was just, admiring your mailbox," she said with a smile so fake it could have been sold at Party City. "Admiring it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or taking pictures of it?" "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I couldn't help but notice that your mailbox doesn't comply with USPS regulations." I stared at her for a moment, trying to decide if she was serious or just bored out of her mind. "Karen," I said slowly, "my mailbox has been here for years. It's perfectly fine." "Oh no," she replied, shaking her head like a disappointed kindergarten teacher. "It's too tall, and the paint is chipped. It's a safety hazard." "A safety hazard?" I repeated, unable to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "Karen, it's a mailbox, not a roller coaster." But she wasn't listening. Instead, she launched into a lecture about how non-compliant mailboxes could cause accidents and delays, and how it was my responsibility as a member of the community to fix it immediately. Now, let me tell you something about my mailbox. It's not fancy or flashy. It's just a standard black mailbox mounted on a wooden post. Sure, the paint might have been a little faded from years of sun exposure, but it worked perfectly fine. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it, except for the fact that Karen had decided to make it her next target. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I ignored her. For the next week or so, Karen made it her mission to harass me about that damn mailbox. She left notes in my mailbox. Ironic, sent me emails. How she got my email address is still a mystery. And even flagged down the mail carrier one day to complain about it in person. Finally, I decided enough was enough. If Karen wanted to play this game, then fine. I'd play along. The next weekend, I went out and bought the ugliest mailbox I could find. It was bright pink with glittery decals all over it. Flowers, butterflies, rainbows, you name it. It looked like something straight out of a Lisa Frank fever dream. But I didn't stop there. I also bought a giant wooden post shaped like a wolf howling at the moon and mounted the pink glittery mailbox on top of it. Then I painted the post bright red and added LED lights so it would glow at night like some kind of tacky roadside attraction. When it was finished, I stood back and admired my handiwork with a satisfied grin. It was hideous, absolutely hideous, but that was the point. The next morning, as expected, Karen showed up at my driveway bright and early with her phone in hand, ready to document my latest violation. But when she saw the new mailbox, oh man, you should have seen her face. Her jaw dropped so fast I thought it might hit the ground. She stood there staring at it for what felt like an eternity before finally sputtering out, What is that?" "It's my new mailbox," I said cheerfully. "You were right, the old one wasn't up to code. So I fixed it." "Fixed it?" she shrieked. "This is even worse." "Oh no," I replied innocently. "It's perfectly compliant with USPS regulations." I checked, and I had checked thoroughly. The height was within the acceptable range. The post was sturdy. Even the LED lights were technically allowed as long as they didn't interfere with visibility. Karen looked like she was about to have an aneurysm as she stormed off muttering something about filing another complaint with the HOA. Good luck with that. For weeks after that, people in the neighborhood kept stopping by to take pictures of my ridiculous mailbox. And honestly, it became kind of famous in its own right. Someone even posted about it on social media with the caption, "When you live next to an HOA dictator but refuse to back down." Eventually, Karen gave up on trying to get rid of my mailbox, or at least stopped bothering me about it directly, but every time I saw her walking past my property after that, she'd glare at it like it had personally insulted her family. And honestly, that made all the effort totally worth it. Because if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's that sometimes fighting back doesn't mean going big or dramatic. Sometimes all you need is a little creativity and maybe a bright pink glittery wolf-themed mailbox. So, after the mailbox fiasco, I thought I'd finally reached the end of my saga with Karen. I mean, how much more could she possibly throw at me? She tried trespassing, legal threats, boundary expansions, mailbox complaints, you name it. And I'd countered every single one of her moves with a combination of logic, petty creativity, and sheer stubbornness. Surely she'd run out of steam by now, right? Wrong. Because Karen wasn't just determined. She was vindictive. And when she couldn't win against me directly, she decided to take her fight to the next level. The wolves. Now, let me remind you, Luna and Thor are perfectly legal. They live in an enclosure that meets every state and federal regulation. They're registered with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. They're tattooed for identification. They're basically model citizens compared to half the people in this neighborhood. But Karen didn't care about any of that. She decided that if she couldn't get rid of me, she'd try to get rid of them. It started with another anonymous complaint to animal control, this time claiming that my wolves were aggressive and had escaped their enclosure multiple times. Of course, none of this was true. Luna and Thor had never escaped their enclosure because it's built like Fort Knox, and they're about as aggressive as a pair of sleepy golden retrievers. When the animal control officer showed up to investigate, again, he took one look at my setup inside. "Let me guess," he said. "Karen?" "Karen," I confirmed. He shook his head and muttered something under his breath about wasting taxpayer dollars before giving me the all-clear and heading back to his truck. But I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't going to stop until she found a way to make her accusations stick. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I got a letter from her lawyer claiming that my wolves were a public nuisance and demanding their immediate removal from the property. The letter cited vague HOA bylaws about dangerous animals and included a list of supposed incidents involving Luna and Thor, none of which had actually happened. Now, I could have ignored the letter entirely since it had no legal basis. Remember? I'm not part of the HOA, but at this point, I was so fed up with Karen's antics that I decided it was time to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. So I called Dave, my lawyer, and told him everything. He listened patiently as I vented about Karen's latest stunt before saying, "All right, Jack, it's time to go nuclear." "Nuclear?" I asked. "Nuclear," he confirmed. Dave explained that while Karen's complaints were baseless, they were still causing unnecessary stress and wasting everyone's time, including mine, his, animal control's, and even her own lawyers. So instead of just responding to her letter like we usually did, he suggested filing a formal harassment complaint against her with the county, and possibly even pursuing a restraining order if she didn't back off. Now, I'm not usually one for escalating things unnecessarily, but at this point, Karen had pushed me too far. It was time to send a message. Dave drafted up the paperwork for the harassment complaint and submitted it to the county along with a detailed timeline of every ridiculous stunt Karen had pulled over the past few months, from trespassing on my property to filing false complaints about my wolves. He also included copies of all the evidence we'd collected, security camera footage, emails, certified letters, you name it. A week later, Karen received notice of the complaint, and let me tell you, she did not take it well. The next morning, she showed up at my driveway, again, demanding to speak with me. She was furious, red-faced, shouting incoherent threats about suing me for defamation and emotional distress. But instead of engaging with her like I usually did, I simply held up my phone and said calmly, "Karen, You're trespassing again. Leave now or I'll call the police." She stared at me for a moment like she couldn't believe what she was hearing before finally storming off in a huff. A few days later, Dave called me with some good news. Karen had agreed to drop all complaints against me, including the ones about Luna and Thor, in exchange for us withdrawing the harassment complaint. Apparently her lawyer had convinced her that dragging this out any further would only make things worse for her. And honestly, he was probably right. So just like that, it was over. Karen stopped bothering me entirely after that. No more notes in my mailbox. No more surprise visits from inspectors or lawyers. No more passive-aggressive emails about community standards. It was like she'd finally realized that no matter how hard she tried to control me or my property, she couldn't win. And honestly, that was all I ever wanted. To be left alone so I could enjoy my land in peace without someone constantly trying to tell me what to do. As for Luna and Thor, they're still here, happy, healthy, and completely oblivious to all the drama they unintentionally caused over the past few months. And every time I see them lounging in their enclosure or hear them howling softly at night, I can't help but smile knowing that they were part of what finally brought Karen down. Because if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's that standing up for yourself isn't always easy or fun or convenient. But sometimes it's absolutely worth it. And hey, if you ever find yourself dealing with an HOA dictator who thinks they can push you around, just remember, wolves are always an option.